Crash, bang, wallop. We're back for another live discussion about the big events of the day coming up on this week's Live with Littlewood in front of our live studio audience here in Westminster. Tonight, we're going to be discussing lies, damned lies and statistics. Is the media accurately representing the COVID story? And we'll also be talking about MPs' second jobs, their salaries, where they get their money from, whether they're consultants, how they should operate in a proper democracy. And we'll be asking, should freedom lovers really care about the rise of corporate wokery? All that coming up on this edition of Live with Littlewood. Kaboom, kapow, welcome to another action-packed edition of Live with Littlewood, with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the IEA. We have another stellar lineup of guests on this evening's show to help pilot our way through some of the controversies of the last week or so from a free market perspective. It's great we're again joined by a live audience here in Westminster, and if you'd like to join the live audience in future shows, please consider becoming an IEA online patron. You can find the information in the show notes below. If you're enjoying the show, please make sure you hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to make sure that you don't miss any IEA London content. Coming up later on the show, I'll be joined by GB News journalist and broadcaster Patrick Christys and by the Economist and IEA fellow Andrew Lilico to discuss misinformation about COVID statistics. Who's to blame? The experts, the media, or neither? I'll also be joined from the home team by the IEA's head of media, Emily Carver. She'll be giving her views on corporate wokery. But first up, great privilege to welcome to the show Media Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, Danielle Boxall, and John Macdonald, Director of Strategy at the Adam Smith Institute. Welcome.
Thank you.
You haven't got a drink. This is a major oversight.
Yes, yeah. I can't nick one of yours.
You can nick one of mine. Do you want a beer? Go for it. I'm well stocked. So, I want to start by discussing what have been kind of labelled side hustles. Should MPs have second jobs? I've never liked the term side hustle. It automatically makes something sound seedy, right? But we've seen Owen Patterson's career terminated for apparently, he denies it all, of course, having taken payment from companies that he's then accused of lobbying for. We've now got Geoffrey Cox earning, was it 700 grand, sitting on a beach in the British Virgin Islands, or at least that's the way it's been characterised. Danielle, let me start with you, because you guys at the Taxpayers Alliance, right, you're our watchdog on making sure that our parliamentarians don't spend too much of our money and are not enriching themselves. What's your take on it? Because you guys tend to argue you want to keep MP salaries low, but if they're earning a ton of cash in the private sector, good for them, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. I mean, the way that it's been sort of spun is that we don't want these career politicians, people that are just sort of in politics for their own, their own promotion. They want to be sort of like famous. You know, they say that Westminster is Hollywood for people that are ugly. But on the other side of the coin, they're saying, well, you know, MPs shouldn't be doing this outside work. So what would we, how do we want it? Do we want people that have an enriched lives? They have views from outside of Westminster. They don't sort of, they're not there for their own enforcement. They're just there for to sort of represent their constituents.
And the constituents can decide, right? I guess if you think your MP's spending too long being a lawyer or a doctor or a brain surgeon or whatever, then you can throw them out of the next election.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, we have a situation where we have maximum transparency. They have to say how many hours they're doing on these extra jobs. They're saying how much money.
I didn't know that.
Yes, yeah, they have to declare how many hours.
Red tape gone mad.
Yeah. So constituents have the data there, and they can decide if they want to get rid of them at the next election or not.
John, what's your take on this? Because I hear all of this and I'm quite attracted to Danielle's view that, we want people from other backgrounds who've pursued other careers, keep those careers going, keeps them in touch with, the real world or with different institutions. Is there anything to worry about here?
Well, I mean, at the risk of sounding easy on sleazy, I think there has to be a distinction between lobbying, which I think they found Owen Paterson pretty bang to rights on that issue, and I think it's proportionate that he's no longer working as an MP. But in Geoffrey Cox's case, I think it's absolutely fine that he chooses to carry on working in his profession as a lawyer whilst maintaining his interests as an MP. As he pointed out himself, and as you've mentioned already, I think it's completely appropriate for constituents to decide whether or not they're okay with that sort of level of working in one job and working in another. But I think that it's important to encourage talented and successful people to become MPs. I think all this talk about stopping MPs from having second jobs would lead to a situation in which you had either people who were independently wealthy, who perhaps might not be that engaged with civic life, or political zealots. I mean, we've seen plenty of those in certain political parties.
I'm quite in favour of political zealots. I think I want a few more of them in our public life, don't you?
Okay. Well,
I don't like the wishy-washy, middle of the road, don't know where they stand people. I want a few more zealots, no?
Okay. Well, that's fair enough. I mean, there are a few in the Labour Party, if that's your gig. But what we want are people who are competent and who have succeeded in life and who don't have to take too large a pay cut to become an MP, I think.
Okay. So I want to get to the nub of this lobbying issue, Danielle, right? Because we seem to be agreed, or you two are agreed, outside interests, having a career, this is all potentially useful and makes for a more rounded parliament. But I can't get my head around, what is lobbying? It seems to me it's a bit like terrorism. Everybody's against it, but nobody can actually define precisely what it is, right? So, Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, is a lawyer, for example. He pronounces on how he would like the law changed or reformed. Is that lobbying because he's a lawyer, or is this just his honest political position? Same with, let's say you were a consultant for a pharmaceutical company. Let's say that was your background or whatever. And COVID-19 pops up, and you sort of say, well, actually, the pharmaceutical company and the industry that I'm involved with, we reckon we could get these vaccines rolled out or this particular drug rolled out really quickly. Should you be barred from saying that? Is that lobbying? Help me here. What is it we're trying to stop?
Well, I mean, it's a very confusing situation because we're talking about second jobs, but the biggest sort of second job in Parliament is being a minister. But then being a minister means that you're working for the government, but the job of MPs is to then scrutinise the government. So where is the line drawn there? Are you lobbying for the government? Are you, what sort of role are you taking there? So I think it's quite difficult to determine what lobbying is. But I think, the main thing that we really need to be worried about is taxpayer-funded lobbying. So one thing that we did a lot of work into is the amount of money that was given to Stonewall, the group that has the Diversity Champions Fund, a lot of departments.
They've even been dropped by the BBC now for being too woke. That's
news.
quite a high bar to clear, right? Being dropped by the BBC for being too woke.
So they've been dropped by the BBC. I think Channel 4 have also dropped them as well, another very high bar. Essentially they're taking taxpayers' money from these departments, from public bodies, and then they're in turn using that money to then push for changes in the law. Yep. So I think that is a really sort of a very wrong use of taxpayers' money. But what if it's private money?
What if you're a consultant with Pfizer?
But then in that case, it's not the taxpayers' money that you're using to lobby for rules that taxpayers might disagree with. Obviously, the money is coming from the business that actually wants to see that change. Taxpayers might not want to see that.
Now, you guys at the TPA, am I right, Danielle, you've argued that MPs' salaries should be set to be in step with economic growth. This would have quite an incentive impact. You might think that their pay will go up if economic growth goes up. Do you think that's the best way of sorting out how much we pay them in future?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, in the private sector, you see a lot of sort of performance-related pay. You see bonuses if you're doing well, that kind of thing. So why can't we apply that in the case of the government as well? Why can't we see MPs being paid if they seem to be doing things that are improving the lives of the country and improving our economic performance? I think that would be a really good way of doing it, because at the moment it's set in line with public sector pay, which they have a direct relation on. So
Yep.
they could just pop the public sector pay up, and then in turn they'd get a pay rise.
John, you're a free market kind of guy, right? So you'll accept that if you want to attract higher quality people to any particular role,
Yes.
job, sector, what do? You dial up the salary. If we want tip-top, brilliant MPs, why don't we pay them 180 grand rather than 80 grand?
Well, I mean, I think I'm broadly in agreement with that. I think it's quite bizarre that the average MP gets paid slightly less than an NHS consultant, for example, and it's a pretty awful job, to be honest. It's high risk because there's very little financial reward relative to the kind of exposure that you get to the media and the very unsociable hours that you have to work. And I'm very much in favour of this idea that you could tie MP's salary to economic growth, perhaps something like triple median the median average salary or something. But
should our baseline be higher? Here's some numbers to conjure with.
Sure.
I looked at Singapore. Members of Parliament in Singapore are paid not measurably more, but the equivalent of £95,000 per annum. A US senator gets $174,000 per annum, so what's that, about 120 grand, something of that magnitude. Nigeria, I mean, they must have some absolutely bloody amazing MPs. They're on $1.5 million a year in Nigeria. top end public servants there.
Well, maybe not quite that much, but no, I think in this country we have a bit of a problem in deciding what it is we want MPs to be. I think there's a certain section of the public that wants MPs to sort of be a humble servant and to accept that this is a job that you should do for the love of country and love of people rather than for any sort of financial reward. But I think fundamentally, if we want our MPs to become, and especially ministers, if they want to be problem solvers, we have to pay them better.
Danielle, you're not going to like this. I've seen you all over the airwaves saying, no, come on, you want more than 80 grand, you're absolutely taking the mick. This is, 3 times the average salary there or thereabouts. But what do you think of if we really want to attract top-end talent, let the salary go up, no?
Well, I don't really buy this argument because if you mentioned some various parliaments, well, look at the EU. Do you think all MEPs are really great? They pay quite a lot of money, aren't they? But
think how terrible they'd be if you paid them less.
Obviously, it's, I don't think people go into politics because they see it as a financial gain opportunity. I think they should be going into politics because they want to represent their constituents. It's an honour to be elected as an MP, and I think that's the way it should be. And, 80 grand is quite a lot of money for most people. The average salary is like less than 30k in this country.
Let me tackle it from the other end of the telescope then. Why don't we say it's naught? You're a public servant. We're expecting you to be intelligent enough and qualified enough to have already made your money or to be able to earn, adequate amounts of money outside of Parliament. Your salary's naught.
Well, again, I think it goes back to what John was saying earlier. We then end up seeing people that have money from outside, maybe that's inherited wealth. It could also put off younger people getting into politics because they haven't had
too many young people in politics, I reckon.
I'm not an MP though, so I do get paid for what I do.
So do you think they got it bang on right at whatever it is, 81,900? Are you like, that's the sweet spot? We've got it, not a penny more, not a penny less.
No, I don't think that's necessarily the best way of setting it. Again, I'd like to see it, in line with GDP. But I think at the moment the current amount is quite generous, I would say, for MPs.
Well, I've got a few other suggested incentive schemes. How about this one? Because I quite like the tying it with GDP growth thing, but I'm willing to turn the screw a bit tighter than that. I reckon MPs only get paid out of the budget surplus run by the government, right? So if there's a budget deficit, it's naught. If there's a budget surplus, well, we can start to pay you. Actually do it on deficit or surplus. What do you say to that, John?
Well, I mean, I think if we, as sort of low-tax free marketeers, we probably want our MPs to be doing less, not more. Mm-hmm. And, the less they interfere with the market, presumably the more the economy will grow, and presumably it'll be better for them as well. So I think it's an all-round win if we can pull it off.
Mm-hmm. So should we cut their hours, Danielle? Is that the actual issue? We can actually sort of say, well, we're going to actually knock it back to 40 grand, but there's going to be half as much legislation going through Parliament. I mean, that would be a win in the right direction, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, read less tape is always good, but, there are no sort of hours that MPs have to do. It's all sort of just a contract between you and the constituents that you represent, and how you decide to do that is up to you. So they could spend lots of hours in Parliament, or they could spend not very much. And we've seen a bit of a wide variety of people on both ends of the spectrum.
Well, what would you say, Danielle, to going the full Texas, right? The Texas legislature only meets for 140 days every 2 years, and they are paid $7,200 each. Cut the hours, cut the salary.
No, I mean, that's one way of doing it. I mean, I think we'd have to see how the public responds to that. I think people like to know that they're being stood up for in the day-to-day. The things like the constituency surgeries are quite important to a lot of people, but I think maybe that could be a way of sort of cutting back on the parliamentary hand in our lives.
John, what do you think? Do you want to go the full Texas? Perhaps even the full Utah? The Utah legislature meets for 45 days a year. They're paid $5,000 each.
Crikey. Well, I don't think that our parliamentary system quite lends itself to that in practicality, but in principle, yes. I think we can certainly use that as a guiding star for what we should be looking at doing.
So I've got another couple of ideas I want to put to you as well, and I've said this cheekily. I said it as a joke to a Tory MP a few years ago that I was having an argument with, but I decided afterwards it wasn't a joke, it was an absolutely brilliant piece of imaginative public policy. My suggestion was for the major infrastructure projects, ones in which we are told they are forecasting a great rate of return, HS2 for example, the first seed money to be invested should be the Parliamentary Pension Fund. And obviously, if HS2 does brilliantly, well, they'll get heavy pensions. If it doesn't do so well, they lose their pension. Do you think we should invest their pensions in these sort of things? Another incentive, Danielle, a bit like the economic growth incentive. Think long and hard before you want to invest your entire pension in HS2.
I mean, I think we all know what we'd like to do with HS2, which is to scrap it, of course. But I do think that there are a lot of things that Parliament seems to do, and they think, oh well, this is just pennies here and there, pennies there. We're talking about billions and billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. And Rishi Sunak, he goes on about how, oh yes, I really do believe this isn't my money, it's taxpayers' money. But we haven't really seen that. We've seen quite a lot of investment programmes, particularly in the last budget. I think our fiscal headroom was eaten up by half of all the spending commitments. So, it does seem like that there is a sort of lax attitude towards the way we're spending money.
Was it Milton Friedman who pointed out there's only 4 ways you spend money? You can spend your own money on yourself. At this point, you are very sensitive to both the quality and the price of the item. You want the highest quality and the lowest price. You can spend your own money on somebody else, buying Aunt Mildred a Christmas present. At this point, you're at least price sensitive, but probably not that bothered about the quality, right?
Depends how often you see them.
Yeah, depends how often you see them. Or you can spend other people's money on yourself. At this point, who cares about the price, but you still care about the quality because it's for you. Or, and this is the quadrant that politicians are in, you spend other people's money on other people. At which point, why care about either the price or the quality? Wouldn't you agree, John?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've said in the past that Boris is continuing to spend like a drunken sailor with flagrant disregard for the taxpayer. And, I like this idea that we could sort of tie MPs' incentives to a growing economy and to the economic success of the nation. Sort of like, I suppose, how hedge fund managers in the US have to own a portion of stocks that they recommend to their clients. I'm not sure whether or not that works, but sort of something like that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, okay, and here's my other wizard wheeze I want to put to you as well in terms of getting costs down. Forever and a day there's been that, 650 MPs is way too many, ridiculous. I think David Cameron had a fairly modest plan to cut it to 600, trimming it a bit. Why don't we say to the cohort of MPs, here's the total salary bill, divide it up as you want. If there's 650 of you, you'll get 80 grand a year each. If you decide you only need 325 of you there, we'll double your salary. If you decide you only need 100 of you, then we can multiply your salary by 6. Is that the way to actually reduce the size of Parliament, do you think, Danielle? Fix the overall salary bill and they decide how to divvy it up.
Well, that's interesting, but I think the first place I'd like to do that is probably the House of Lords. We've got over, I think it's 800 members of the House of Lords, and a lot
Isn't
of
it the biggest parliament in the world, apart from the Workers' Committee of the Chinese Communist Party or something? Yeah.
So I think that's the first place I'd like to take the axe to.
Right, and how many MPs, or is that barking up the wrong tree? Doesn't really matter one way or another, John.
Asking MPs to decide how many MPs there are sounds like a recipe for a battle royale, in my opinion. But
at the moment, they've got no incentive to cut it, right?
No, sure.
None. And, all the boundaries get moved. But if you actually go, we're trying to get financial market price mechanism incentives into the system, right?
No, there should certainly be less. I'm not entirely sure how you could sort of rearrange boundaries to kind of cut that down quite so radically. But, 650 is a real problem.
And Danielle, where do you think this, as I said, there's too many young people in politics. I'm old enough to remember the sort of the sleaze scandals under John Major. Do you think this is now a rabbit that's just going to run and run and run? Every single MP's kind of external interests and whether they've made any money is going to be picked through, and this is going to be a bit like the expenses scandal. There's going to be a complete collapse of public faith in the standards that MPs are upholding? Or is it just one or two sort of, with Addo and Patterson, there'll be a by-election. We've got to look into whether Geoffrey Cox used a Zoom account on a parliamentary laptop or his own laptop or whatever it is. Is it all going to pass over in the next, few days, or is this going to run and run?
Well, I mean, you say that, is this going to make confidence in MPs collapse? Well, I don't think there is much confidence to get rid of in the first place. So I kind of fail to see how that it could go even lower, but maybe it will do. Maybe they'll dig themselves deeper into a hole. But it seems like there's quite a few of them that have these external jobs. So I think they're all trying to protect each other in quite a lot of ways. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But for me, the real sleaze of this was the way the government handled the Owen Paterson case. I mean, he was caught bang to rights. The committee decided that, yes, he's definitely been he's been going against the rules here. And then the government just tried to sort of disregard that and try and get their man out at the last minute in this massive U-turn. And I think that's the real sort of, that's going to have the real political impact.
But are you worried a little bit about I always get worried now when I hear about an independent watchdog, because I think the term independent could just as easily be replaced with unanswerable to anybody, right? And that's the slight problem, isn't it? That we have all of these regulators. They may well be well-intentioned, but, should their word really be law, or should it be Parliament to decide if they're going to kick people out?
Well, it is a bit of both at the moment. So we have this committee, and then we also have MPs that vote on the decision at the end. So I do think we have a sort of best of both worlds scenario. I think perhaps where it could be changed is the right to appeal, which obviously Owen Paterson made a big statement about. He didn't really have a chance to have his say or have an appeal, whereas in the private sector or the normal world you would be able to do that. I think that perhaps is where it could change.
And John, just finally on this session, and then I know Danielle, you need to leave us. But John, do you think we're going to get into some weird position in which we adopt something like the Labour Party is proposing, in which you can't have external interests as a consultant, whatever that means, but you can have external interests as an NHS worker or a lawyer or an author of books, in which case you've got a vested interest in VAT not being applied to books. Do you think there's actually going to be a change in the rules here, or are we just plucking out people that we deem to have broken the rules?
I think probably the latter. I think sort of the Labour Party's probably got quite a vested interest in allowing certain kinds of jobs to be nice second jobs. They're always kind of bigging up, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, whatever. I think...
To be able to do left-wing external work, but not right-wing external work.
No, exactly.
That could be where we get to. Well, I'm glad we put the politicians to rights. Danielle, thanks for joining us. I know you need to leave us in just a moment. Before we move on to our next session, asking whether we can trust the media and the experts at all, we think here at the IEA it's important not just to restrain the desires of our MPs to add more rules and regulations to our lives, but to have a long, hard look at the regulatory agencies themselves. And just last week, we welcomed a range of speakers from the digital sphere to join us for a conference on the meaning of competition. Is Facebook too big? Do we need to break up Google? That sort of thing. We were delighted to be joined by Chris Philp, Minister of State at DCMS, and the Competition and Market Authority Executive Director, Michael Grenfell, and many more. We'll be posting the sessions on our YouTube channel every Monday for the next few weeks. And here's a little taster coming up just now.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak here today at the Institute for Economic Affairs, the home of free markets, of course. As you just said, I was lucky enough to be appointed by the Prime Minister just a few weeks ago as Minister for Technology and the Digital Economy. He didn't so much ask me to do the job as tell me, obviously, as in the nature of these things. But when he did ask me to move from the Home Office to DCMS as Minister for Tech and Digital Economy, I was delighted, because my background before entering Parliament 6.5 years ago was in setting up and running various different businesses. One of which was a tech-centred business, which we ended up floating on the stock market, and eventually it got taken over by Booker and then by Tesco. So setting up new businesses is something I just spent 15 or 17 years doing before entering Parliament. You can imagine going from doing that to Parliament was quite a shock to the system. And look, it's very clear that a free market, dynamic, innovative economy is a critical thing for our country to foster and develop. All kinds of benefits obviously flow from a dynamic, competitive, free market economy, ranging from wealth creation and employment creation, most obviously, through to innovation. It improves the quality of people's lives. But of course it goes beyond that as well, as Hayek argued in his seminal book, The Road to Serfdom, that free markets and a free economy are actually essential for freedom itself as well. So
check out that Meaning of Competition conference. You'll see segments of it going up on the IEA London YouTube channel over the next few weeks. Well, I've got two great new guests to introduce now. We've put MPs and their salaries to rights. We're now going to sort of tackle the media and misinformation as well. So please give a very, very warm welcome to two staunch defenders of competition, award-winning freelance journalist, political commentator, GB News presenter Patrick Christys, and Telegraph columnist, Economist and IEA fellow Andrew Lilico. Welcome, gents. So, welcome, gents. I should just take your two's temperature on this MP's salaries thing. I mean, Patrick, this must be great news for you. It's all exciting, isn't it? Political scandal for any journalist.
Yes, completeness of cannon fodder. Although there is an argument, to be fair, to be made with the idea that MPs should be paid more. Now, I'm not necessarily in favour of that, but I think the argument speaks for itself, which is if you want to attract the best, and we do want to attract the best, we don't want a room full of Angela Rayners, do we, for goodness sake? So in that case, you could argue that you should incentivise them in order to do it. If we just park the idea that they're all in it for a deep sense of public duty, which they're obviously not, then actually maybe you should have to pay them more to stop them just, going and getting a job in the city. I think there is that fine line, and I'm worried that the wider public interpretation of what's been going on at the moment is a blurring of this line between your ability to go and make money after dinner speaking, for example, or just having another job that in no way influences your ability to be a politician or your bias or anything like that. And then actually doing something against the rules. And I think we're in danger at the moment, anyway, of blurring that line to the point where any MP who earns any other income whatsoever is seen as a bit of a wrong-un. And that has to be incorrect. You must be able to go and have a couple of jobs. I mean, even John Prescott had a couple of jags, didn't he? Yeah. Surely everyone else can have a couple of jobs. Yeah. And
the Tory Scottish leader's a football referee, right?
Well,
gets paid for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as if they didn't take enough abuse already.
Yeah.
Just might as well go and get shouted out by Gary Lineker at the weekend.
Yeah. Andrew, what's your take on this? What's the sensible kind of market-orientated approach to solving it, or doesn't it lend itself to that sort of analysis?
No, I don't think that being an MP is a job at all. So I think the whole discussion of second jobs is misconceived. Being an MP is a vocation or a calling, or it's something like being a councillor, a kind of public service role. The MP's salary was only ever a kind of expenses which came in because in the 19th century it turned out that because of things got more complicated and you ended up with more time involved, you couldn't have anybody do it unless they were fabulously wealthy. And so, to me, I think it's entirely proper it's best if MPs have actual jobs, because that makes them more like the rest of us. What they're supposed to be is our representatives. So another thing I think that people get wrong is that MPs aren't the rulers. The MPs aren't the government. The MPs are our representatives holding the government to account.
Yeah.
So they're supposed to be people like us. It isn't that they're supposed to sort of spend all of their time governing the country. What they're supposed to do is have some sense of what it is that living is like, so that they can reflect that back to the government. And if all that they ever do is politics, I think that that's a flaw. The ideal is for MPs to have jobs and then do being an MP part-time. That's the right way round. And so I think the whole conversation is just misconceived.
All right, we've put members of Parliament, we've sorted all that one out. Let's move on to our next section. We're calling this, why is the media misreporting COVID statistics? And let me give a little bit of background here. So, Patrick, you're going to be in the firing line now, right? The media, it's all your fault. It's all your fault in the media. So, this is what happened, if I've got this right. The NHS England Chief Executive Amanda Pritchard on Monday declared, quote, "We have had 14 times the number of people with COVID in hospital than we saw this time last year. Actually, in early November 2020, there were over 11,000 people in English hospitals with COVID. For her claim to be true, there would now need to be over 150,000 people in hospital with COVID today. The actual number is 7,000. NHS England has tried to clarify these remarks by saying she was talking about the admissions from August 2021, but I don't think that makes much numerical sense either. Obviously, if you want to get the daily figures, all you need is a laptop or a TV screen. They're easy to get to. And if you were to look at other statistics here, Professor Lockdown himself, Neil Ferguson's predictions. This seems to be a common problem, predictions and statistics, perhaps used to generate fear. He predicted 500,000 COVID deaths at the beginning of the pandemic. The current figure is 142,000, a high number, but a third of what he predicted. In August, Ferguson said that daily infection rates would hit a record of 100,000 and could peak at 200,000. In reality, daily cases barely topped 30,000. Andrew, let me come back to you. You had your own set of predictions, both for the last winter and for this year, that seem a bit closer to the mark. Why is the real world evidence borne out your prediction instead of some of these experts that say you should have the advantage over you, shouldn't they?
Well, I think they're distinct questions. The question of why the media gets all of these things wrong and what's going on there. I actually think that the SAGE models last year were reasonably good. So things like you quoted the 500,000 figure, but of course that was without considerable mitigations, and we had lots of lockdowns and other kinds of things. That's why their numbers are much lower. I think it's reasonable to imagine that they would have been much higher if we'd not had those mitigations. And they got the numbers for the second wave. A lot of people. I mean, I was saying that there would be a second wave from April. I had figures from May forecasting about 85,000 for the second wave, and right through September, October, I tried to tell everybody. Even on your show, right, last year. I don't know whether you remember. It was September, October. I was trying to say. I said we've got a second wave coming. It's going to be bigger than the first. What are the political implications of that going to be for the government? Nobody believed me. Right, and so, and of course we did. We ended up with 90,000 people dying in the second wave. So last year, those kinds of forecasts that the SAGE and others did were pretty good. This year, they've been fairly poor. But, and I think one of the things there is that some of the academics and so on involved in this weren't really up for the real import of the decisions that they were making. They were in an environment in which if they said, things will be okay if you relax, and then they got that wrong, then tens of thousands of people would die. And I don't think that they weren't people who dealt with these sorts of policy decisions all the time, and for whom that was, if you deal with policy all the time, I do advice on policy of all sorts all the time. Of course, some people will die if you get things wrong. And you just have to live with that. That's just the consequence of the kinds of decisions.
The risk of being alive,
but it's the risk of participating in that kind of decision making. And these people weren't used to it. And so as a consequence of not being used to it, I think that they've always tended to want to say, well, here's my number. And the number which they wanted to put as the most optimistic number was actually what they thought. And then they had a series of other things which were much more pessimistic as the ones that they talked to the government about.
So, Patrick, why does absolutely everybody in the media keep getting this wrong, with the single exception of Andrew Lilico on the Live with Littlewood show? He gets things right.
And GB News. Thank
you, yes. I appreciate you've done my PR for me there. But, no, I think there's a parroting of a government line. I think it's easy for them to do it. I think they're in the grips of the same fear, possibly, that a lot of people, and I'll just say this, on the left, I think, are, which is the idea that they don't want to do a Michael Fish, right, which is get it wrong, and then all of a sudden, Marjorie's had her bins blown over and everything's gone to... But I think we're in a situation now where we need to start asking more questions from this government, right? It's all very well and good, especially from the media, to sit there and say cases are going up, cases are spiking, and it's fear, 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 fear. But actually, last Saturday, cases went down 11% based on the previous Saturday. Now, that's fake news, by definition. That's fake news. Sky did that, the BBC did that. I find that astonishing. But I also would like to think now, actually, if the BBC or those outlets did their job, they would start to ask serious questions about the grip under which our current government is vis-à-vis Big Pharma, right? Now, you end up in a situation where they're constantly moving the goalposts. We're currently in a situation where they're about to change the definition of what it means to be fully vaccinated. It's gone from 2 jabs to 3 jabs. And I think that's a massive problem, personally. And I do think we're in a position at the moment whereby it's easy for the government to come out and parrot something. And, for example, this. Sajid Javid is holding Christmas to ransom at the moment. Right now, I very much doubt that the good Lord sent his only son down to earth to die for our sins, so that our health secretary, at the stroke of a pen, could hold the celebration of his birth to ransom. I think that's absolutely outrageous, right? It's not the preserve of government. I mean, who on earth gave this guy this power, And so, but that's where we are, and a lot of our mainstream media, unfortunately for me anyway, seem to be all too willing to go along with that. And on top of that, just quickly, sorry, we're also in a situation, and this is to clarify a point I made earlier about Big Pharma. The JCVI has basically come out and has certainly not recommended that 12 to 15-year-olds should get the jab. Now, Pfizer are saying they're trying to make that happen. COVID, by and large, bounces off kids. It also, this vaccine is proven to, whilst it does absolutely unequivocally, I'm very glad it exists, but it does not really increase your ability too much to be able to pass this thing on. Why is our government now so beholden to the idea that we have to start sticking needles in kids' arms? And I've got an issue with that.
John, let me come to you, because I'm sort of betwixt and between here. I feel great sticking it to politicians, but I don't feel so good sticking it to the free media. I want a free media, and if they say things I disagree with or even get things wrong, well, that's part and parcel of having a free media. I don't want some committee of experts to tell Patrick what he can and can't say on GB News. I want him to have the right to get things wrong. He can be called out for that.
Which
right?
I exercise regularly.
But that's why they pay you the big bucks, Patrick, right? Yeah. But here are a few examples. Christiana Amanpour on CNN said that cases were spiking. Sky News said cases are escalating by the day. BBC Breakfast on there recently, a presenter read out a question from a viewer suggesting that cases were rising amongst school-aged children. All right, you always need to understand the context, and reading out a question from a viewer isn't the same as stating something as fact, sure. But is there a problem that the only news is bad news?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think the problem here, I'm quite willing to apply Occam's razor, so I'm not sure I'd attribute malice to it, but I think there's definitely a bias towards crisis in the media, and I think that's why they sort of select very bizarre data to use, and oftentimes incorrect data to use, in the way they represent things. And
Andrew, I mean, I'm trying to, I want your economist lens from this. Are incentives sort of misaligned? You're a journalist, you want a big story, so the bigger the number, the scarier the story, the more horrific the statistics, the more instinctively attractive that is. I'm not saying you just immediately print anything without sort of checking it out, but you're leaning in that direction. See, my ideal news programme is to switch on, see somebody like Patrick say, welcome to my new show. Not much has happened today. Here's Bill with the weather, but that never happens, right? You've got to fill out all of the time, and it's got to be sort of shock, horror, arresting material.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think maybe in this context, it might be a bit more like the idea of whether you want to have one currency to help your economy function. There needs to be truth. Right, so you can't just have that. Some people are going to be telling completely untrue things. The cases have been contracting now for 18 days relative to the previous week in a row.
Yep.
That's the longest that's happened since February, when we were in full lockdown. In fact, you might say, well, how long is that relative to when they were rising? Well, they only rose for 19 days in a row. So you can hardly say, oh well, they were rising for a long time, so people haven't caught up yet. The media is still, even last night, Jeremy Vine, the estimable Jeremy Vine, his team put out a tweet saying that cases were rising. Kate Burley on Monday said cases are rising. You've quoted various other things. It's absolutely relentless. And they don't seem to want to know. And I've tried to understand why that would be. As I say, I don't think it can really be just a matter of inertia. I think it could be some kind of reasoning to the premise. So you've got the Labour Party and various lefty academics saying that we need restrictions. And I wonder whether, with their sort of left-leaning sympathies of many of the journalists in these major broadcasters, they feel like that must be right. And so in order for that to be right, well, it would have to be true that cases are going up, so therefore cases must be going up. So they're reasoning back to that thought. It also might be a kind of COVID trauma, everything seemed so bad for so long that they just can't believe that things might be getting better. But I think that it is a problem. I mean, the estimable Chris Snowdon of this parish made the point that if a journalist said that Ronaldo played for Chelsea, right, or Theresa May was still Prime Minister, it would be absolutely ridiculous. But that's exactly what they're doing here when they're saying that cases are going up. And at some point soon, I think it will become a matter for Ofcom to intervene. You cannot, in the same way that you can't have people debauching the currency and your economy functioning properly. You can't have people just telling untruths on the news every day and have a healthy news broadcasting system. That's not how competition in the news must work.
Patrick, is the problem here that entirely understandably, and indeed as I've just done, that the challenge when you're trying to present it, what's going on is that you need to simplify and be specific, right? So it's difficult to say, well, actually you're quite right. Ferguson did say, well, if there weren't any mitigations, and in fact there were these mitigations. But before you know it, you've read out 9 pages of terms and conditions rather than actually reported the news. And therefore what you're striving for, right, I know this from my notes here, is, give me a very arresting number that's very specific or a very specific date, and simplify it. I want to sort of sum up what's happening in 2 sentences, and maybe that's just not possible.
Well, there's obviously the natural desire to be concise. I would also argue that there's a big world of stuff out there, and if you are having to find yourself in a situation where you're having to sensationalise something like a coronavirus figure in order to fill a show, then actually you've got massive problems. There are other figures that are happening, for example, people coming over the channel, etc., etc., etc. There's no shortage of news that you have to give. And actually, what a lot of people do, and the BBC is as guilty as this as other outlets, as indeed any outlet would be, which is looking at the demographics of your audience and being in tune with that audience. Now, the fact is that a lot of people who decide that they want to tune in to watch Dan Walker on BBC, or indeed Jeremy Vine, I never trust a man who rides a penny farthing, I would say, but anyway, and I stand by that. But these people have got their own views. They're double masked, don't they? They're basically terrified. I mean, anyone in my opinion anyway who subscribes to the Guardian is probably afraid to draw the curtains in the morning anyway, so they want to hear fear, right? But actually, I would flip it on its head and say, if you just tell the truth and you hold things to account, I stand by the idea that basically most people now are sick of Chris Whitty. Most people now are sick of Professor Pantsdown. You referred to him as Professor Lockdown earlier. I don't think you gave him his full title. And most people are sick of these people. Why? Because they keep getting it wrong, and because they have been the ones who've sensationalised more than a lot of the right-wing outlets. It's not very often I get to say that, but it's true. They have actually sensationalised more, and they've instilled fear. And I think that one day this lot should be held to account for the fact that this government and those people caused the largest ever mental health crisis that this country has ever seen. And they did that. Right, and they're continuing to do that, and I think that's a massive, massive problem.
I think there's a fair point there, which is that I was critical of some of the press for getting these things wrong, but as you pointed out earlier, what we have is the senior people from the NHS. If the NHS bosses tell you that the case is going up inexorably and it's 14 times as bad as it was in the past and that kind of thing, we can hardly blame the journalists for just saying what it is that they're being told by these experts.
And John, coming to you, do you think there's a problem? I'm going to go a bit full Hayek here, right? So Hayek said the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And again, we strive for these specific numbers, but the confidence interval of whether you're right is just colossal, right? And we've talked about the COVID crisis, but you could apply this to Brexit. I can't remember the exact number now, but we were told in no uncertainty by George Osborne that if we voted to leave, in 2030 each household would be, £4,237.28 worse off, as if you could get it to anything approaching this level of specificity. Is that the problem? That we're not, in general terms in public discourse, modest enough to know that we don't know very much?
Yeah, I think there's a real problem with there's not really an incentive within your in-group to hit signal rather than noise. So what we've seen around coronavirus reporting is actually you can carry on saying things are going very awfully, you can misrepresent data, you can say things, cases are rising when in fact they aren't, but you don't get penalised in the same way as someone who says that there is no pandemic, right? It's a scandemic. Yeah. So you're sort of being wrong.
But that's clearly nonsense as well.
Well, exactly.
Right, yeah.
But you're being wrong in the right way, and that should be seen as much of a problem as the latter.
Patrick, let me put on this sort of specificity point that people want numbers that and they're presented as facts, but actually their guess is. I don't want to get into the whole climate change argument, but it seems to be another area where we've got very specific numbers, right? We've got to stop the world warming by more than 1.5 degrees. Now, I'm no climatologist, but I find it hard to believe that if we keep it to 1.499, that is total success. And if we go to 1.51, that's apocalypse. And same with the date, it's got to be done on the 1st of January 2050 or whatever. Very, very precise, overly precise numbers.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating the numbers that they aren't telling telling us, which is exactly how much money it's going to cost every single one of us to achieve a net zero target, which is impossible to achieve as long as China doesn't get on board with it, which it absolutely won't. And so therefore, it's impossible. Should we not maybe be looking elsewhere? I also think it's a point that doesn't get made enough for me, this, and I think there's a massive scam going on with regards to the Extinction Rebellion lot and everything. And actually, I think it's mean and I think it's wrong. They looked at someone like Greta Thunberg and they thought, she was, until very recently anyway, an actual child, right? Yeah. She also does, as far as I'm aware, have autism, etc. And what they did was they used her, in my opinion anyway, as a front woman, as a shield. And they said, if you want to criticise what we're saying now, you have to criticise a child who's got some kind of mental issue, and you can't do that because then you become, a bad person, right? And so that was a big shield, because actually that blocks a lot of the criticism, and the valid criticism, in my opinion, anyway. And I think that was deeply wrong, and it is deeply wrong, in my opinion.
Andrew, what's your take of this, this strive for over-specificity? Do you see what I'm saying? That actually things are much more complex, much less knowable than we really think.
Well, I agree with that to some extent. I have some sympathy with the idea that if you're making policy, then you need to set a number of some sort. So I think I don't think one necessarily is saying that by having a target of a certain figure that if you're trying to hold things to a target. So I think that's a little bit unfair. I think that people tend to underestimate the extent to which there's uncertainty, particularly about the benefits of policies. So it can be very difficult to work out those. It's the classic sort of thing that free market people complain about all the time, is that people focus overly on the concrete and they fail to think about how things will change in the background, the unseen changes. But one of the big problems, I think, and I think it's true of climate change, but I think it's particularly true of COVID, is that the media found it very difficult to work out who knew anything that was relevant to talk to. So you would get them all the time talking to immunologists and asking them to opine upon epidemiological questions, and then people would they'd speak to Ferguson, who's an epidemiologist, and ask him about how good the vaccines were, and it would just, and this led to absolutely epic. There was one case I saw where they spoke to a professor of virology, and he was claiming that cases were doubling every 2 days, I think it was, when they were doubling every 2 months, which was an error which would mean that over a couple of months' time you'd end up with several billion times as many infections as he was suggesting. And so I think that if you're getting, I think it was 15 orders of magnitude I worked it out as is the nature of the error here. And if you can't get something right to the nearest 15 orders of magnitude, I suggest maybe you shouldn't be asked about those questions again another time. But the media just don't know who knows the value. And I have some sympathy. It's very difficult to work out in some of these questions who's the relevant person to speak to. And I think that lies at the heart of a lot of these problems. And I think that one of the lessons that they should get, and I think it would apply to climate change as well, is a first step when you're working out either what to ask of somebody or who to get is who's the relevant person who might actually know something. Just because it's about a virus doesn't mean you want a virologist.
Patrick, would you agree with that? At GB News, you're very wise at picking the experts. IEA spokespeople are on GB News very frequently, so excellent choice of guests.
Absolutely, and I'm glad to announce that you're on tomorrow now, Jack. I do think there is an issue there, and I think it's worth noting that, when the pandemic was kicking off, for example, and we were being told about the death numbers, you got the worst death case in Europe, there was a period of time where you could have got coronavirus, recovered from it, jumped out of a plane without a parachute and hit the ground and been classed as dying from coronavirus, right? That's a problem, okay? So maybe the way that we collate our stats is not always as accurate as it could be,
John, I know you need to leave us. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much, my friend. And we're going to move to the next section in just a moment. We've covered MPs, we've covered the media. We're now going to move on to corporations and how they're behaving. Even if there isn't a spike in coronavirus cases, it does seem to be there is a major spike in corporate wokery. And perhaps this is having a bit of a chilling effect on what people are willing to say in their workplace, perhaps even what they're willing to think in their workplace. Now, last month at the Conservative Party conference, we ran with our friends at the Taxpayers Alliance the Think Tent Marquee, and one of the events there that we co-hosted with them was titled "You Can't Say That," about the risk of free speech and of woke culture. Here's a short clip, and you'll be able to watch the rest online tomorrow.
I think Michael makes a very, very good point, is that there are some thorny, difficult issues around this topic. But the trouble is we haven't been able to have those discussions because one side of the argument is just branded as hateful, and that puts a stop to any discussions that we need to have about those kind of things. Actually, it is quite complex, and particularly with the issue of incitement. You know, in America, they have the Brandenburg test. They have a very high threshold for incitement to violence. It needs to be very high. But we're not able to have this conversation. I think what underpins an awful lot of what's going on in this country and the reluctance of politicians to do anything about it is there an assumption and a misunderstanding of the power of speech. Now, speech is powerful, but seems to be now a prevalent idea that harmful jokes, off-colour jokes, say, or racial slurs, or all these kind of things, that words work like incantations and they escape into society, and suddenly people get influenced in a kind of, and people just react mechanically on cues to the language that they hear. But we know that's not true. So we've had 6 decades of media effects theory research, and we know it isn't the case that public behaviour changes according to mass media consumption. It's been debunked, and yet we behave as though the programmes that people watch, the films that people watch, you know, we have to delete that episode of Fawlty Towers, we have to take this scene out of this comedy show, because there's just this article of faith now that we're all just robots who act on cues from language. But it's not true. If we were allowed to have the debate and look at the data and look at the actual studies on this, then maybe that faith would dissipate. But we haven't been allowed to. So I think, yes, we should have the difficult discussions, but we haven't even got to that point yet.
So, to help our 2 guests, Patrick and Andrew, tackle the problems of corporate culture and wokery, and whether we should really, really care about it at all, please welcome my last guest from the home team, IEA Head of Media, Emily Carver. Emily.
Hello. I'm good.
Right. Now this is always my favourite section, talking about wokery, because it's sort of, I find it very confusing, very amusing, but I don't really know whether I should be concerned about it. But here's a few facts to conjure with. So we're not just talking wokery here. We've now got Marks and Spencer wokery, a particular Marks and Spencer brand of it. M&S have begun to encourage workers to add their pronouns to their name badges. That's what M&S have done. British Airways, I'm told, have now dropped ladies and gentlemen from any announcement that they make over tannoys in order to make people feel more welcome. And Tesco's employees are being encouraged to join a book club to discuss intersectional diverse literature, whatever the hell that is. I mean, I'm a kind of free market kind of guy. Companies should be able to do what they want, I guess. I find this weird, but I'm not a shareholder in any of those companies. Who cares? Emily, should we care about this at all?
Absolutely, you should care. You should care about it just as much as you care about the fight against socialism. It's another ideology, wokeism. It's an ideology that puts race and gender above all else when you're looking at an individual. It puts everyone into groups. It divides people into victims and oppressors. And it's fundamentally illiberal insofar as it completely rejects the idea of the individual in favour of the collective. So it's closer to fascism than it is to liberalism. And it's something that you can't just sit back and say, oh, well, you know, it's people's choices whether they wear a pronoun badge, or it's, you know, BAs, it's their free market choice as a private company to decide whether they say ladies and gentlemen and so on. It's all part of a wider movement, a wider ideology that seeks to put issues of gender and race above all else.
Okay,
and with the pronouns...
Is this really the pronoun? I mean, look,
it's in
I don't
all
need
of
to
our
know your
institutions,
pronouns,
Mark.
but does it really matter if someone's got pronouns on their badge? I mean, I'm not totally convinced that this is an example of extreme fascism that you list pronouns on a work badge.
This is just one example. So you could argue, and you could say, and a lot of people at the IEA probably would make this point, that, you know, why should we worry about it? You know, it's free speech, you can put your pronouns on, you know, it's not mandatory.
Yep.
Although I would actually say that it had a sort of diktat-style element to it. The M&S...
Warmly encouraged.
The M&S leadership said more than warmly encouraged. They said encourage as many people as possible who are working here, as many staff as possible. If you sent around an email saying, I encourage as many of you to do something...
I often do.
I think,
come and have a beer, usually.
Well, that's why I love working here, because I can speak my mind and I don't have to put my pronouns on my badge, if I had a badge. I don't need a badge. But yeah, I think that it had a diktat-style element to it, and it also means that people at M&S, people who are working at M&S, will feel like they have to sign up to the belief system that incorporates gender ideology, gender fluidity, and that if you put she, her on your badge, therefore everyone else has to call you Mildred instead of Mark.
I'm more of a they, them kind of guy myself. Andrew, should we actually just be relaxed about this? Maybe there's a market for woke. Who's to say there isn't?
Well, I think that there's a distinction between different levels here. So I think that there is, first of all, there's a deeply flawed ideology, which I think does, I think Emily essentially characterises it correctly as being a kind of class war. It's a deliberate and systematic attempt to carve people up, place them into fixed categories which aren't about their opinions, they're about some kind of fundamental characteristics that people have. So it's supposed to be your race or your gender or your sexual orientation or other kinds of things.
But I thought the whole thing was you can pick those now. You can choose to be whatever you want.
But whether you can really, I wouldn't suggest in too many settings you tell people that they can pick their sexual orientation. But anyway,
it compels you to agree.
But your gender, you can pick.
They may be able to pick your gender.
This is how the theory goes. I'm not.
Maybe. But I'm saying that there's a distinction between there's a flawed ideology, and then there is a version of that which is very intolerant and imposes this on others. So I'd make a distinction between the flawed ideology and the version of it, which is the most common version, where they're also very intolerant and they try to export and impose that ideology in an intolerant manner on other people.
That's like saying not all socialism is, making a difference between socialism and communism. It's sort of it's very different, isn't it?
Well, and some of them are worse than the ones who want to invade other countries or people are worse than the ones who want to do things democratically. They're both wrong.
Yeah. The communist government of North Korea is indeed worse than the socialist government of the United Kingdom.
So that's what I would say.
Equally dangerous.
But I think a third thing here is that just because there are some people who do some dumb things, I don't think you should assume that every specific thing which they sign up for is something which is necessarily terrible. So I'll give you an example. I mean, I personally find that, at least for some people, because you have a lot of people who come from a lot of different countries and I don't actually quite know what their names, how to interpret the names. I wouldn't always find it unhelpful to have the pronoun. Because I can end up in embarrassing situations where you get some people with certain kinds of names and you have no idea. Well, and I don't know whether to refer to them as a male or a female. And maybe some people choose to dress in a very why shouldn't they? A very gender non-specific way, and they might want to indicate what it is. So I wouldn't say that necessarily in every setting those things are harmful. I would also say that if people want to choose for themselves to express certain things. I mean, I actually think that the thing with pronouns is rather weird in that a pronoun ought to be something which is an objective thing which everybody can use. But we seem to have drifted, I don't know whether it's that bad, but we seem to have drifted into something a bit like an old-fashioned like 18th century, or the way that people would do things in Germany and they used to, where you had this business of thouing me. So some people have these things with pronouns where you're allowed to refer to them by their sex pronoun if you know them very well, but other people have to call you they.
Or it's like tu vu in French.
Exactly. It's like an informal. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
I don't think it isn't what I would do.
Put it in your email, isn't it? I mean, that's smart.
But that's not the motivation for this.
It's not the motivation amongst the woke people for this, but I'm saying that just because some people are doing it badly doesn't mean that some people aren't doing it. And you shouldn't necessarily assume that everybody is as wicked as everybody else.
Patrick, what do you make of all this? I mean, is it something to sort of roll one's eyes at and just say, well, this is all a bit trivial and silly? Or is Emily right? There's something pernicious going on.
I think it's part of a much bigger picture. I mean, I've never misgendered anyone on the way to the frozen food aisle, as far as I'm aware. So I don't see what the point of all of this stuff is. I think maybe I'm more unconsciously progressive than I thought that I was. But it seems like it's part of a much more sinister picture, more of an agenda. So if you don't do this now as a company, so as a corporation, I think you said the phrase before, is there a market for woke? I think they're overestimating the market for woke. I think most people don't care, right? But now, if you own a company and you aren't actively, it's like silence is violence, isn't it? If you don't actively go out of your way now to do this kind of stuff, at some point you run the risk of being seen as being transphobic, something like that. Well, let's have a look at the way that Stonewall operate. They run a league table of organisations with which they are involved with, and they advise these organisations for a fee onto how to be progressive when it comes to things like trans issues. It's a giant Ponzi scheme, right? That's what Stonewall is. It's a massive pyramid scheme, okay? If you don't pay them, then they bump you down your list, right? And that's the way it works. And you're paying for advice that is only, given towards a very small snapshot of society. Now, my concern is this, and I'll be quite succinct about this, is the kind of creeping, asphyxiating hand of this onto wider society. And when we see it, especially, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon's gone bang in favour of all this stuff, that seeps down to children. Now, the idea that Sandra from the geography department might one day have a word with my 5-year-old about whether or not he or she, or indeed they, is a boy or a girl. Do you mind not, Sandra? And then I'll deal with that at home. And then if I go in about that, which I obviously will, then I'm a transphobe, probably get done for a hate crime, and maybe the kid gets taken off me anyway. I don't know. I've got a massive problem with this stuff if that wasn't immediately obvious.
Yeah, it does seem that you got but it's our audience has got a massive problem with this stuff as well. I'm just wondering whether there is, going back to Andrew, there is an element of this that's quite attractive to sort of liberal-minded people, isn't there? I mean, I'm sort of, I want people to, choose their own lifestyle, choose their own live their life as they choose and see fit. I mean, I've never been able to quite get my head around gender dysphoria or whatever it is. I don't understand it. I don't suffer from it. I don't have it. But I'm very open to people living their lives as best they can, and we seem to have a better means of allowing that now. What's sort of not to like from a liberal mindset?
Yeah, as I say, I think there's some distinction between the things where you allow people to express themselves as they see fit and to be who they want to be, and some questions of fact. So rather, as I was talking earlier in about the news, some things are facts, right? So if you're biologically a woman, you're biologically a woman. Mm-hmm. There isn't some other question about it. You're and the facts matter, and I think that it's important. Now, we could change what we mean by the word woman and make it mean something else, but it doesn't mean that now. And I don't really see what the merit is of wanting to change the meaning of these terms. And again, if somebody has a dialect, I mean, when has it ever been in the past that we told you what dialect you had to speak? If in your dialect the words he and she refer to biological sex, not gender, why should we forbid you from using the language we use? And it does seem to me that what the problem here is an awful lot of authoritarian imposition on others. So people who claim they want to be just left to live their lives as they see fit don't want to let other people live their lives as they see fit.
And it's men trying to change, by and large, it's men trying to change the definition of womanhood. Now, I don't think women threw themselves in front of horses so that someone with a male genitalia could tell them what the definition of being a woman is.
It's all about compelling other people to treat you as something that they don't believe. So if you are wearing a badge and you are clearly, or to the layman or to the average person, clearly not what you say you are. So you said you were she, her, and you were clearly, it was a biological man standing in front of you. You are being told to suspend your version of reality, and it compels your speech in that way. And this is why Jordan Peterson was under fire so massively those years ago when he didn't say anything transphobic. He purely said that he simply didn't want his speech, he didn't want to have to use pronouns for someone that wasn't of that sex. So it's different from just saying, live and let live. People are, trying to change the way that you view the world.
Where do you think there's a backlash now on this, Emily? That there's been, some people might be enforcing it, but I don't know whether the backlash to date has been much more than a rolling of eyes, but to give you an example, I bumped into an old friend on Monday night, and he said that he was pretty furious. His wife, who's 5'1", plays rugby as a scrum half. And he showed me on the phone the picture of one of the players that she was against,
Oh, no.
who was 6'8" and massive, right? And was someone who had now identified as a woman. I mean, this is.
He didn't
not
let
just
her
getting
play.
Yeah, she played. Yeah, at this point, it's sort of getting dangerous potentially, right? And I wondered, Emily, whether you thought that it's amongst sort of conservative-leaning women, and I don't mean the term conservative, with any pejorative, that's where the backlash is coming from.
Yeah.
That, 6'8" Gary is now joining the netball team or whatever. It slightly, alters the sport you thought you were engaging in.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh because it's quite serious. But yes, the backlash is coming from women who tend to be middle-aged, older than myself, who have careers in various industries and so on and feel secure enough to talk about these issues. I've been told personally that I should probably leave these issues alone and save it for older women because I may, witness myself firsthand cancel culture because these issues are so fraught. But you've seen...
We don't cancel anything.
No, I'm safe here. But Kathleen Stock, for example, who was essentially hounded out of her university for believing that sex was real and sex was immutable, i.e. you were born, you live, and you can't change the chromosomes that you were born with. But there is a good reaction, and you could argue that that's the free market in action, is the fact that we see universities being set up to counter the sort of cancel culture atmosphere. You see free speech nights being set up to counter the sort of, the lefty, censorious type of comedy that we see. And there are other places where this is happening, but it's not happening on the scale I'd like. And it takes a very strong person with a strong character to stand up and say, I don't believe that, actually, and I'm not into this woke ideology.
I just want to wrap up with your thoughts about the backlash. Patrick, let me start with you, because although I don't think I'd describe the Cambridge Union as a corporation, it is nevertheless part of the establishment. They're now blacklisting speakers who will never be invited back. And this chap called Andrew Graham Dixon did an impression of Hitler to illustrate the insanity of the Nazis' concept of degenerate art. He's been blacklisted for life. There is a backlash, however. Others are now stepping forward, including John Cleese, saying, please put me on the blacklist. I'm going to put myself on the blacklist. The author of, I forget his name now, Captain Corelli's Mandolin, has done the same thing. Please put me on the blacklist. Is the backlash coming of Cambridge Union, who, sort of allowed this to happen and then said, oh my God, looking back on it, it was so terrible, and now are actually seeing, very popular figures saying, if you're going to behave like that, I'm not going to engage with you.
Yeah, and I think the backlash is coming, but I think, as Emily rightly said, actually, it's from people who are already very secure in their existence. Now, this is also the same university where one college now makes you have to sit an unconscious bias exam, and unless you get 100% in that exam, which by definition means subscribing to that particular view of the world, then you're you're not allowed to progress, apparently, in your careers. I think it's part of a wider virtue signalling thing. Now, universities have always been, I think, hotbeds of, or should always be anyway, hotbeds of in a way, radical thought, right? That's where this shouldn't come from the lecturers, by the way. It should come from the students that are there, that are still finding themselves, that are by and large very young and very sparky. And that's great, and they don't always have to agree with me. So we've got no problem with the idea that people might think this guy went too far and we should cancel him. What I have a problem with is the fact that they actually went ahead and did it, right? I think that's an issue. There should be some adults in the room there. I think it's part of a wider thing now, just quickly, which is on just a general, very patronising virtue signalling thing. Carlsberg is the best example. Their latest advert, Carlsberg used to do cracking adverts, great adverts. Now, their latest one is a CGI seal swimming around the sea, and whenever you buy a pint of Carlsberg, they donate some money towards seagrass.
Clubbed over the head.
No, that's Canada. That's a very different advert. Visit Vancouver. But this one, whenever you buy a Carlsberg now, they donate some money towards seagrass. No man has ever walked towards the bar and gone, right, which pint do I want today? Well, if I buy this one, they're going to give some money to seagrass. That's for me.
Andrew, is there a market backlash coming? I mean, we've seen the announcement of the University of Austin in the US, which, if it gets off the ground, I think it probably will, is going to be committed to, quoting them, freedom of inquiry, freedom of conscience and civil discourse. It might be that there is a market reaction here, and people start saying, well, if all of these other universities are woke and there's a demand for non-wokery, the market will fill that gap. Yeah?
I think definitely is in the US, but I think the US university system has for some time had catered for more niche things. So you could go to universities where
it's a bit more monoculture here, isn't it? In Britain?
Yeah. I mean, in the US, you could go to universities where they believed in special creation, if you wanted, and other ones where they would be ultra woke, and as you say, all these different kinds of things. So that's. How well that will work in the UK, I don't know. I mean, but I think that we certainly should consider the possibility of the government. I mean, the government funds all these things. If it isn't at some universities, St Andrews, I think, has a wokeness test for you to be able to go at all, to matriculate.
Well, you have to prove you're woke.
Yes, you have to do a test.
Just take the knee and wear the rainbow flag.
What are the sort of questions?
Well, there's various things about you have to say, for example, that you accept that colour blindness is racist. As an approach to life, things like, and each of them, you only have to get a certain. You don't have to get 100% in that one. You have to get some percent. But if you get
you
too
only have to
many
be
right,
like 68% woke.
that's right, exactly. But you have a whole. You have a whole. I think that there is quite a widespread effect of this. What happens already is that people with centre-right or right-wing views, at the very least, and it'll probably be people who have feminist views and other kinds of things as well in the future, choose to do subjects and choose to join societies which don't involve them exposing any of their political opinions. So they go and they become engineers or economists.
Or
things
they
like this.
just self-censor
entirely. But I don't think. I think it's worse than that.
But they may opt out of
because
subjects,
they're not going to go and do English.
It's true. I probably wouldn't now.
You're not going to be able to study certain topics at all unless you're sufficiently woke. And I think think in that environment, the government needs to consider funding universities for people who are more centre-right or they're tolerant woke
But the
people.
problem is that this won't happen because it's throughout all of our institutions. The civil service itself is so wedded to the idea of diversity and inclusion that it's one of, if not the, seemingly, it seems to be the top priority.
Even St Andrews.
It seems to be their top priority in who they choose to employ in some of these jobs, particularly in those non-exec jobs, but also down in the graduate jobs and so on. It's almost as if all your qualifications don't count. It's about what box you tick. And it's so regressive. It's the ideology that we must confront just as much as socialism.
I don't think Boris's team is that bad on some of these questions, though. Not universal. They're not always great, but there is some political backlash now, and if from the top, enough directive action from the top, I think you could make a difference over time.
Patrick, let me finish with you. Do you think there's a chilling effect even on very outspoken folk like you and I? And give you the example. Andrew was actually saying on occasions pronouns can be useful if you don't actually. And this came up to me the other day. And somebody said, "Oh, do you know?" I can't remember the name now, but it wasn't obvious from the name whether the person was, what gender the person was. So I was then going to say, "Oh," and I was about to say, "Is that a man or a woman?" And then I found myself saying, "Is that what is their gender identity?" So even an outspoken person like me, there's been a effect. Tell me you haven't caught the woke disease in the same way I have.
I don't think there's much danger of that. But I thought you made a cracking point actually there about the idea, especially if someone sends you an email that you're not aware of. You know, there are certain things. Well, actually, I wouldn't know necessarily who they are. What I would say though is that it's something I've never particularly cared about in terms of self-censoring, because I've always just thought, A, I'm perfectly willing to tolerate people with other views, and I would wrongly at times expect the same back. B, I also think that there's more common sense potentially, although I would, on my side than others. C, I also think fundamentally that the vast majority of the public feel the same way that I do about the situation. And the case in point, I think, would be the Brexit referendum, right? 52-48. And the big argument for the Remainers was, well, hang on a minute, if we should have got everyone in the country to vote. If you'd have got every single person in this country to go and vote, you'd have got absolutely stuffed. Brexit would have gone up by more than 52%. Most people who would have gone out and voted would have gone and voted for Brexit, the people that didn't, in my opinion anyway. And I think that this, as long as I feel as though I'm on the right side of history about things, then I'm not going to stop talking about it.
Sound way to finish. Andrew, Emily, Patrick, thanks very much for joining us. Thanks to my earlier guests, Danielle Boxall from the Taxpayers Alliance and John Macdonald from the Adam Smith Institute. Thanks to all of you watching at home. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Live in Littlewood in 2 weeks' time, however, will be virtual, not in our studio. That's not because I've been given foresight of the new COVID restrictions, I hasten to add. It's because we're going to be hosting some of our American friends exactly 1 year after the official transition period began from the Trump to the Biden administration, to ask whether politicians are doing any better on that side of the pond. I keep telling my American friends that I have forgiven them for 1776. How's that low tax stuff working out for them? So join me in 2 weeks' time for a discussion with some of our American colleagues as well. Thanks to our studio audience here in the room. Huge thanks as ever to our top IEA online patrons: Donald Blaney, Eric Keane, James Burns, Mark Edwards, Philip Ozouf, Richard Leader, Robert Appleby, Timothy Worrell and Costa Manis. Thanks very much indeed for your support. Think of joining them as well by becoming an IEA IEA online patron. Notes are in the show notes below. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.